everybody, and welcome to episode 55 of Now and Men. We're the podcast on men, masculinities, and gender equality. I'm Stephen Burrell, and I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people in Australia. And as always, I'm here with Sandy Raxton. How are things going with you, Sandy? Any news from the UK?
I'm fine, thanks. Here in the UK, well, there's quite a lot of media and policy chatter on what to do about boys, young men, masculinity. Isn't there always? And I'm hoping that our guest today will help us shed some light on what's going on. How are you doing, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks, Sandy. Yeah. I suppose one thing I can report on here is I've been quite obsessed with the TV series The Handmaid's Tale, because the sixth and final series has just come out recently. So but I've only recently started watching the series, so I've been quite hooked on that. And it's very pertinent, of course, to many of the themes we talk about on the podcast. And unfortunately, it feels very pertinent to the world as it is now. But yeah, I'm very pleased to have with us today Dr. Finn Mackay, whose work has had a big impact on me over the years. So Finn is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of the West of England in Bristol, and they have a long and inspiring track record of feminist research and activism. So before returning to academia, Finn was involved in education and youth work, where they worked on domestic violence prevention and anti-bullying. And in 2004, for example, they founded the London Feminist Network and revived the tradition of London Reclaim the Night. So hi, Finn. It's really great to have you with us.
Hello there. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and welcome from me to Finn. You've written two excellent books in your career. The first one, Radical Feminism, Feminist Activism in Movement, and that was in 2015. And more recently, Female Masculinities and the Gender Wars, The Politics of Sex in 2021. We'd like to talk to you about both of these. But first of all, you recently published a paper called Positive Humanity When... Is Masculinity Worth Saving? In the Journal of Gender Studies. And reading it, I mean, and it's a powerful polemic, but it feels quite a frustrated assessment of where debates about masculinity and work with men and boys are at the moment. Is that right? And if so, can you explain why that is?
Well, that's interesting. The frustration came through in that piece. There's a lot of brilliant work going on, and interestingly, when I first submitted the piece and it was reviewed, the feedback I got was that I hadn't acknowledged enough all the wonderful feminist and pro-feminist work that there is out there by male gender scholars. So they were saying, well, what about Jeff Hearn? What about Stoltenberg and Pease? And in a way, that sort of, well, clearly that was good feedback because I hadn't put my point across. Because my point was, yes, there are these excellent people, but they're not getting invited. They're not getting invited to Downing Street, to Westminster, to make up the new schools curriculum by the Department of Education. They're not the ones going on the Today programme. They're not the ones being put in charge of new, research institutes and stuff like that. And that's probably not a coincidence that the strong feminist gender abolitionist work doesn't get the same sort of platform. And that's why I was interested to listen to your interview with Jackson Katz, and it's great to see that he has got a new book out, which hopefully will have a lot of reach and go out into the mainstream as well.
Sure. And in the paper you discuss how there's a continuing societal obsession with, inverted commas, saving masculinity, even within work which seeks to critique the pressures and expectations that exist around being a man, notions that we should strive to foster positive, inclusive, caring masculinities and so on. And this has been a recurring topic on the podcast too. So why is it, in your view, that it's unhelpful to simply try and recreate masculinity in a new and more healthy form?
Yeah, as I said in the paper, it maybe seems trite or unhelpful. If things work and people find them useful and it's part of their journey, as I said, you could think, well, what's the point of sort of objecting to that? Is it just semantics? But of course, masculinity it's one half of a dualism. It's part of a hierarchy. If we're constantly trying to do it differently or better, that just feels to me like tinkering around the edges. We don't really need it at all, surely. Why is it needed? And people get very defensive about it. The people get defensive about gender, and it always reminds me of a section in the book by Bell Hooks where she talks about if you went door to door asking just everyday people about what they thought about problems with gender, so male violence against women, rape, domestic abuse, the pay gap between men and women, nearly everybody would say, oh yes, that's terrible, we don't agree with that. But if you then said to them, do you think we should get rid of gender then? We should get rid of masculinity and femininity. Most people would balk at that. People get very defensive and are very wedded to gender. And I think that's interesting in itself that people get so defensive about it. But I just think I'm much more interested in a common humanity between us all. I'm interested in leveling. I want to de-essentialize language. I think that's really important. And I think it does set a tone, and it does help us to envision where we want to be and want to get to. So I do think it matters.
I mean, you're also critical of the notion that masculinity is, in inverted commas, in crisis as well. You know, I mean, in a sense, it's always been in crisis, or in fact, it is a crisis in itself. No, that's what you?
Yes, that's what I've always said, that masculinity is not so much in crisis, but indeed it is a crisis. It's a crisis for a lot of people, and arguably a crisis for the planet. I just saw some new research out. In fact, I think you shared it, Stephen, about how macho, masculine attitudes can be seen to contributing towards climate catastrophe. So attitudes that define masculinity around things like driving cars, possessing cars and big sort of things, eating meat, these kind of very tragic, sort of archaic masculine stereotypes. And the more people that feel pushed to do those, the more men that feel pushed to do those. Of course, those are not healthy things often for the individuals themselves, but certainly for the planet. And that's what that new research was saying. But yes, there's never been a time when masculinity wasn't in crisis, as there is, since men started writing or scraping things on cave walls or producing paintings or plays or songs. They have been talking about manhood and masculinity, losing it, finding it, journeying towards it, teaching it to other boys and men what it should be. Then you've got, as states were created, you've got lots of state concerns about what masculinity is. I'm not going to, everybody knows that's to do with militarism, that's to do with capitalism. Have we got men that are healthy and fit enough to drive all these wheels that we want them to drive, to be ready to fight wars when they are wanted to fight wars? It's never not been in crisis. There's always been a concern about it from society and from culture and religion and from, organized state apparatus as well. It's a very fragile thing. And if it wasn't, then we wouldn't have all the narratives that we do around it, around manhood being something that you strive for, something that you gain, something that can be shamed or can be lost or put into question.
I mean, would you say that the core problem is not really masculinity, it's actually patriarchy and that form of sort of social governance which affects us all?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's toxic patriarchy that is the problem. Absolutely. Gender is the operating system of patriarchy. So we won't fix the problem of patriarchy by just adding more types of gender or different ways to do masculinity. You can't solve a problem of gender with more gender.
I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I think you talk about in your Female Masculinities book about how a big part of the problem is how we're so keen to segregate people based on sex and gender, so keeping girls and boys apart from a young age. And I can't help but think of this here. Is that part of the problem, that I suppose by kind of reinforcing or trying to save masculinity and produce a kind of healthy masculinity, we are still reproducing that sense that there are these huge inherent differences between us, aren't we?
Yes, and I think the differences are less than what we are led to believe. I think that people fetishize the differences because we fetishize gender, and we're very attached, we're very wedded and intimately wedded in our psyches, in our sexuality, in our relationships to people around these gender categories and gender norms. And so they're socialized into and instilled in children from a young age. And I think this can lead to essentialism. It leads to this idea that we are two different species. And I've written before about how I don't even like to see things like boys being taught, and I've seen this myself, I've got children, you still see this sort of thing happening, boys being told to let little girls go first, or if you're at a party, or let the little girls choose first what they want. Now, I don't think that's feminist in any way, shape, or form. And obviously, that's recognized now as instilling a sort of form of, benevolent sexism and chauvinism, which we don't want to teach boys either. This is teaching boys that girls are this different species, inherently this sort of much more delicate species, or even things like don't hit girls. Well, don't hit anybody. That's not nice. Don't hit other boys either. You wouldn't want to be hit yourself. It's just, the more you look at it, the more you see it. I think we need much more leveling. We need much more de-essentializing. I was actually looking at the curriculum a few days ago because my son's school sends out notes about what they're covering, and they're going to be doing the RSE, relationships and sex education curriculum. And in there for his year, there was one of the components they cover was on, I understand how girls' bodies change at puberty, and I understand that they need to look after them, how they need to look after themselves physically and emotionally. And I was waiting for the next component saying, I understand how boys' bodies change at puberty and how they need to look after themselves physically and emotionally. And it wasn't there. And I think that sort of thing is the sort of thing that is picked up by those people who wrongly call themselves men's rights activists, because they're not actually doing much for men's rights. I think that a lot of what those MRA type people do is counter to rights and, positive well-being for men, actually. But that's the sort of thing that those people would grab onto and show as proof of women being aggrandized, women being put at the top, men's interests not getting taken account of, boys' interests not getting taken account of. So I don't think it helps to sort of give a gift to that sort of argument. But I also do think it's wrong, because we're furthering this idea that boys are indestructible, that boys are tough, that we don't need to worry about boys' emotional health or physical health, that they'll go through puberty and whatever, they'll handle it, and actually it'll be great and it'll be wonderful and we don't really need to talk about it. Whereas girls will have all these mood swings and pains and periods, and it gets a bit messy, and we don't really want to dwell on that much. I don't think that's healthy at all. I don't want to. It's not that I want to paint boys as sort of weak or victims. It's that I don't want to paint girls as that either. I just want us all to be seen as human bodies that can go through things, that can experience pain, that can experience problems or issues that we might not like, and that can happen to all of us, and that it's important for all of us to look after ourselves.
You raised in your paper the earlier example of the suggestion that boys should maybe start school later than girls, and they can just be left to their own devices until they're, I don't know, age 7 or something.
Yes. This is from Richard Reeves, and it's from his book of Boys and Men, and he's just been put in charge of the new Centre for, what was it called? The Centre for Policy Research on Boys and Men in the UK. So he's heading up that new research centre now on men and masculinities. And yeah, he suggests that boys are not ready for a formal school curriculum. They're not ready to start, and they should spend much longer time doing the early years curriculum, doing forest schools, learning through play. He does not even take into account then what should happen to the girls. Now, anyone who starts his book by saying he doesn't believe in zero-sum approaches, he's a feminist, he doesn't believe in backtracking on women's rights, and then without any reflexivity at all, without any acknowledgement of what that means for the other half of the classroom, he just puts that out there. I think surely that invalidates completely somebody's whole approach and their claim to be against a zero-sum approach. He's also falling into this gender essentialism, which suggests that girls are quiet, compliant, do what they're told, can sit at a desk, can hold a pencil in their hand long enough to write their name, and that boys are, these very active creatures that need to be outdoors being run around like puppies. All children benefit from starting a formal school curriculum later, and the countries that consistently score the best on well-being, on health outcomes and everything, but on educational outcomes as well, they start the formal curriculum later, around 7 at the earliest. Why wouldn't you want that for all children? to without any reflexivity or even concern to the optics of how that statement is going to look. But it hasn't been picked up by people. So, maybe he's right not to care, because no one else really seems to have noticed. And now he's been put in charge of this new research centre.
Actually, living in Australia, people have said to me they're surprised how early we send kids to school in the UK. And I lived in Finland for a while, and that obviously Finland is internationally recognised for its education, and they don't send kids to school until they're 7. But I was thinking about how, at the moment we're facing all these crises, climate crisis, economic crisis, but you're seeing more people perhaps kind of turning to these really traditional gender norms more, right? That it's like people are in their kind of desperation and their struggles, like it can be somehow reassuring to revert backwards to these more traditional ideas about femininity and masculinity. So, of course, with the manosphere becoming more and more prevalent, also things like trad wives and the womanosphere as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think at times of crisis, unfortunately, these ideas, these anchors, things that appear as anchors of stability and certainty, are going to be more seductive at times of crisis. Economic crisis, and that's for individuals in our own families and lives. We're facing economic struggles, and then you've got that played out on the world stage, and then you've got environmental crisis. And even if you don't go along with some of the narratives, it's there, it's out there, there's protests, there's news, we're being fed this all of the time. So it's a very anxious time. And again, I can understand why people want to bring it down to a level that they feel they can control. And so ideas that offer certainty, that you may not be able to change everything, you can't affect everything, but we can start where we're at. And if we make strong families and we move out from there, we can have strong communities. This is what the right wing has always done so well in its offer, because the offer is rightly seductive. We all have notions that our children should be able to play out in the street, and we should be able to leave our doors unlocked, and you'll help your neighbor. These are deep-seated kind of human things. I don't have a problem with those. I just have a problem with the solutions that are being offered to us to get to them, because the solutions being offered by the right are to split off from your neighbor even more, to kill your neighbor, to take from your neighbor. So they're not actually the positive messages, but they utilize those very seductive narratives. So I think, yes, this idea, which was never the case anyway, so it's always rose-tinted and it's always a myth, but this idea that there was a time when men were men and women were women, the man was the head of the household, the man controlled the family, the woman was there to caretake, and at least we knew what that looked like and what that was. So it's there in our kind of psychic cultural memory, even though it never really existed as an ideal, or maybe for a minority of people it did, kind of after the Second World War perhaps. But most working class people have always had to work, women and men. It's rare where one person's wage could support a whole household and a whole family. But this idea, it doesn't seem to matter. The idea is a strong one. And when everything around you is in crisis, I can see why strong and certain ideas become seductive.
So what kind of alternative narrative would you put forward for boys and men, I suppose? I mean, as we mentioned, you published this excellent book on radical feminism. So, for example, what can boys and men learn from kind of radical feminist perspectives on society?
Well, I think John Stoltenberg writes very well on this as well. Radical feminism is demonized in our culture. It's demonized in our education system as well. I can't tell you the amount of times I see on curricula and on curricular resources in the UK simplistic definitions of radical feminism as being the extreme one, the one that's gone too far, a type of feminism that believes that women are superior to men and wants to put women in charge instead of men. Of course, that is not what radical feminism is. That would be the very opposite to what radical feminism wants, because radical feminism is a revolutionary movement. So it doesn't want to leave the world as it is and just have women CEOs and women at the top of all these terrible industries that are, ripping the earth out from underneath us. And it's women instead of men doing it. That's not the sort of end point that radical feminists see. So there is a widespread misunderstanding of what radical feminism even is. But the message of radical feminism is one of hope because it is anti-essentialist. So radical feminism says and teaches that we are all human beings and that we all have capacity to give love and care, to receive love and care, that we can all play a role in our community, that we can matter to ourselves and others, and that we can do that together, in our common humanity, and that essentialism and these stereotypes are taught rather than born. I think that's actually a very positive, that's a man positive message. I often think when I look at those compared to the boys will be boys narratives that I see out there in the world, which seem to set a very low bar for men, I sometimes look at them and I think, boys will be what? Boys will be dead, killed by other men. Boys will be dead through suicide. Boys will be dead through some risk-taking activity that's taken their life. Boys will be dead in wars. Is that what you want? Is that what parents want for their baby boys? It's bizarre. And in order to sustain, of course, this gender hierarchy that we have, which depends upon one half of that binary being the superior one, that is indestructible, that is tough, that is never the victim, that is never put in that feminized position, to maintain that hierarchy, we are apparently willing as a society to sacrifice boys and men every day. People seem okay with it. And then I think, how dare you all say you're men's rights activists? You are not speaking out about this. You are letting it happen because you don't want to acknowledge that men also have frailties, that men are not superhuman. And this is a lot of this. You see this in a lot. You sometimes even see this in anti-violence work that's trying to do good, that sets all men up as some sort of inherent. If women are victims in waiting, then men are cast as predators in waiting. And I don't think that's helpful at all. I think we just set a very low bar for men. We seem to want to wash our hands of the endemic problems of men's sexualized violence against women and children and other men by just going, oh, well, it happens. It's always happened. What are we going to do? We wash our hands of it.
And on a related question, for men who want to support feminism, who support the radical feminist case, what does that look like in your view? How should men be to support?
Yes. Well, I always think we should be doing the opposite of this understanding that we have now of microaggressions. It's very good that we now have an understanding of that. So I think we need sort of micro pacifism, kind of micro pacifism acts. And I've also seen other people talking about micro feminisms, and I think that's a very good idea as well. Challenging language, de-essentializing language, taking responsibility for things on a household level, on a community level, in workplaces, being alert to where gender stereotyping is playing out, who is doing certain roles, who is taking more responsibility for some things, and actively trying to disrupt that. And this is happening. I'm very inspired by a lot of the work that I see, for example, with the idea of the dad strike, Parenting Out Loud, this organization. Men that are going out there and saying we need to disrupt these stereotypes, we need to disrupt these false binaries about what men and women are and what they can do. So I'm very inspired by all of that, and I think we need more of that. And I think those are the sort of people that should be being invited to Westminster and to Parliament, and those are the sort of men that should be put in charge of, new streams of work on this, not people like Martin Daubney, famous for having been the editor of the Lads Mag Loaded. But of course, it's often not those people that get put in place. But I think it's about being conscious. It's about being woke, being awake, and being alert to where gendered patterns are being followed and actively trying to disrupt those gendered patterns. I also think there is positive work going on in terms of consciousness raising work, positive and progressive consciousness raising work amongst men. as women did, for a long time, which, let's not forget, was the bedrock of second wave feminist theory production, activist production came from the ground up. So I'm not saying that progressive men shouldn't get together as well as men and talk about what it means to live as a man, within and under patriarchy. I think if that can be done in a positive way through consciousness raising, I think that's great. Obviously not from the sort of Robert Bly Jungian perspective. That is also burgeoning at the moment. I'm seeing a lot more of that essentialist men's work and men's offerings. But I think that is just more of the same kind of essentialism.
Thanks, Finn. It's only the first half of our podcast, and you've given our audience a lot to think about, including ourselves. So I think we'll just take a quick break, and then we'll be back for second half.
So just to clarify, Finn, before we move forwards, could you perhaps just briefly define what you mean by radical feminism, and also this idea of essentialism as well, which you've mentioned, for any audience members not familiar with that term?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, there is a lot of misunderstanding about what radical feminism is. So firstly, there are loads of different schools or types of feminism. This is a political theory and form of political activism with a long, long history. So there are lots of different schools or types. So if people do an A-level, for example, in politics, sociology, they might cover what gets called the big three types of feminism. So they might study socialist feminism, which is anti-capitalist and has, certain kinds of arguments and framings. And then they might do liberal feminism, which focuses on how existing systems like the law, anti-discrimination policies can be used to improve situations between women and men. And then they'll do radical feminism. Radical feminism wants the same as all the other types. So it is concerned with women as a group and their rights vis-a-vis men as a group and their rights. So it's concerned with women's rights in all spheres of life. So that's politically, culturally, financially, in terms of representation. Radical feminism would also support measures on sex discrimination to stop sex discrimination. But the difference maybe is that radical feminism would not see that as an end point. Stopping discrimination is not the end point. Liberation is the end point. So of course sex discrimination is bad. Of course we should try and stop it. But that's a step along the way towards women's liberation. So radical feminism can be distinguished maybe from the other types, which would be, there's loads of them: eco-feminism, anarcho-feminism, black feminism, womanism, pro-feminism, third-wave feminism. There's loads and loads of different types. And if you want to look at the features that can define radical feminism in particular from the others, there's 4 ways I think you can do this. Number 1 is that radical feminism believes in the existence of patriarchy, that is male supremacy, and prioritizes that. It doesn't think that this is just an idea. Radical feminism thinks this is a fact, that we live within a male supremacist society, and that it's just using the word patriarchy to mean, do men as a group dominate mainstream institutions of power? That doesn't mean all men are in power. It doesn't mean all men have power. When we look at institutions of power and the people at the top of them, they tend to be men from particular backgrounds, elite backgrounds, wealthy men, men that have been privately schooled, men from a certain class. However, there are also rich white women in the world that were privately schooled and come from posh families. Are they 50% of these institutions of power? No. So there's more going on there. It's not just about the elite background and the wealthiness and the racialized patterns. It's also that they're men. Secondly, radical feminism emphasizes sexualized male violence against women as a keystone of women's oppression. So it would prioritize that as an area of analysis, believing that we can't enforce all these other rights if there isn't a sort of basic right to life, and that sexualized male violence against women, of course, is a fundamental threat to life for women. So it would prioritize that as an area of analysis. And then linked to that, thirdly, extends that analysis of sexualized male violence against women to also consider the industries of prostitution and pornography, and how they are both a mirror and a shaper of our cultural attitudes towards women, towards objectification, and towards the ongoing and endemic levels of sexualized violence against women and children. And then 4 would prioritize women-only organizing and women-only leadership, not in opposition to other types, but that, and that's very different to separatism, which is a way of life and a choice to kind of live separately from men, to show that women can do that in a culture where women are told that they can't. That has a proud history too. But women-only organizing is about prioritizing women's leadership and women gaining skills in leadership that women as a group are often told that they don't have or can't do. So I think those are the 4 things that you can kind of distinguish radical feminism from the other types, although they are all wanting to improve women's condition vis-a-vis men. And then essentialism, the way I have always understood it is by taking that word essentialism and thinking of the term essence. And I think in terms of biological essentialism, it's about reducing people down to an assumed essence that is the essence of them at their core, as if something is in their DNA. And it might not show up in everybody, but that it's there enough for us to understand it as a core or as an essence. So biological essentialism, when it's applied to men, would be the sort of stereotypes we're familiar with. So people saying, oh, men are just naturally more focused on the outside world rather than the domestic sphere. Men naturally want to compete with other men. They're just naturally more aggressive. They're naturally more competitive. They're more ambitious. This is just at their essence. This is at their core. They can't change that. They're more focused on objects and things and doing rather than people or babies or caring or animals. So they're less able to do that than women are. And it may not be all men, but this is the essence of men. So I think that's how I kind of have always reminded myself what biological essentialism is. So it's the naturalizing of gender stereotypes. It's what Carol Gilligan always says is mistaking patriarchy for nature. You're saying this is nature. It's not patriarchy, it's nature. So that's what biological essentialism is. And radical feminism and all of radical feminism, and if you look at the works of people like Kate Millett, Susan Brown Miller, who died recently at 90 years old and wrote a fantastic book called Against Our Will. It's a history of rape law and a history of how rape is seen in culture. Excellent. But the last chapter of her book contains a lot of practical actions for how the world can move forward and what should happen. And she has this great line in that last chapter where she says that while the world is the way it is, and we might disagree with a lot of how the world is, but one thing that we should do immediately, while we still have armies and political offices and judiciaries and courts and all the things that we still have, is to just immediately make them 50-50. She actually said in there, maybe we need a period of grace. We should have 60-40 for a while we recalibrate society. So put more women in for a while rather than men. But that this is something that should be done with the utmost urgency, because every institution of power is overwhelmingly in the hands of men, and this matters. Otherwise, women will continue to be what she calls a colonized protectorate of men, which I think is a wonderful line. And I would recommend everyone to read that book, but particularly the last chapter, because it has not gone out of date. Although it was written in the second wave of the women's liberation movement, it is tragically still a live document.
Thanks for those brilliant explanations, Finn. I'm sure people will be reaching for their library books and looking up some of the references that you mentioned there as well. But we wanted to talk about your second book, Female Masculinities and the Gender Wars, and that's based on research you conducted on lesbian and queer masculinities in the UK, in which you surveyed people who identified as or with labels like butch, stud, gender non-conforming, non-binary, transgender. Could you tell us more about what you wanted to do with your research in that case, and how it challenges and expands what we understand about masculinity?
Yeah, that book, the research for that book, I guess what I was concerned about was, in the moment we're in now, certainly in the UK, but in a lot of Western countries and really a lot of places around the world now, we're in this moment of trans panic. We're in these so-called gender wars. And what I saw happening within that was when masculine lesbians or butch lesbians or transgender men or trans men are represented at all. Well, they are just not represented, really. Most of this scrutiny is on trans women. When trans men or trans masculine people are represented, it's in a very infantilized way and a very patronizing way. So they're really weaponized as victims to put forward an argument that poor lesbian women or girls who might just be a bit tomboyish are being brainwashed by big trans, are being forced on a path of medicalization, forced to identify as trans, when actually all they would be is maybe just gender non-conforming women. And then you have even worse narratives than that put forward by, again, in the mainstream, suggesting that puberty is nature's cure for gender nonconformity, and that if we just leave these children, these girls alone, they will go through puberty, and through that they will come to love their womanhood, their female body. They might turn out to be heterosexual, they might turn out to want babies of their own and to breastfeed them and to do all these beautiful things that women's bodies can do. And there's this extremist sort of conspiracy theory that tomboyish girls are being duped, are being transed, and that they're having this womanliness stolen from them. And when you look at some of those narratives and the way people put them across, the heterosexism within them is really off the scale. The lesbophobia within them is off the scale, but it doesn't get picked up. So I see people writing in the Times, the Sunday Times, suggesting that if we just leave these girls, puberty will heal them, and actually they might even turn out to be, wives and mothers, and they'll love their position as women in society. So I was offended by a lot of the simplistic narratives that I saw, and by the erasure of the voices of trans men and trans masculine identified people themselves. So what I really wanted to do was to put their voices back, well, not back, but put them there at all, to allow those people to speak for themselves and ask, also nuanced and controversial questions. What do they feel about identity? What do they feel about the so-called gender wars? And people had a different range of standpoints, but I thought it was important that we actually heard those voices.
And the book actually highlights the contradictions experienced by many of your participants, I think, in simultaneously identifying, with aspects of masculinity whilst also critiquing it. And how do they navigate these challenges and forge authentic identities for themselves in a world which is so quick to punish anyone who doesn't fit into strict gendered boxes?
Yes, I mean, that was all very interesting. I think the sort of reflexivity that you can have when you feel drawn to an option for gender display and gender embodiment that you were never meant to. So you were never meant to be drawn to that option. You were meant to be drawn to the other option. So that gives you a starting point that is just more reflexive, I feel. You have more space there to be reflexive about it, perhaps, than people do when they gravitate towards the option they were meant to have. There's a lot of tensions there too, of course, but it meant that people could be reflexive about it. And yes, that was interesting. And a lot of people said things like, I don't much agree with a lot of what I see about what masculinity is meant to be. I definitely don't like a lot of what it's meant to be. I try and not take on the most negative aspects of it. I try and critique those. And yet, out of the two gender options that we're socialized into and grew up with, people still said, out of those options, I felt more aligned to this one. Yeah, so they were trying not to inhabit some of what they saw as equaling masculinity. They tried to challenge the taking up of space, domineering, talking over. They tried to challenge some of the more negative aspects that can be attached to it. And people also spoke about how, if they presented as masculine, people assumed they would do those things, or assumed they would be certain ways, kind of bullish or, or rougher or more taking control. And of course, a lot of people said, well, I'm not like that at all. But you see, I think all of this is very interesting because I think we can basically take all of this and put it onto men and boys learning to do their masculinity as well. Not all men and boys are bullish and rough and want to be in control. It probably is spread across humans. Some people are like that, and some people aren't. And again, that's always what I'm wanting to do. And I suppose from that work as well, I hoped that maybe we could take from that how we're all learning to do our gender. We're all learning to embody ourselves in these gendered ways. And so, as I say in the book, I'm very open about positioning myself within this. So I grew up with a mum and a dad. They had different roles to what is expected, I suppose. My dad was in manual trades. He was a joiner, but he also took care of all of the housework. He did most of the cooking and cleaning. My mum just didn't. She just wasn't into doing that sort of stuff. So I grew up seeing that as something that men did. So I suppose I didn't have a traditional example in terms of caring and housework responsibilities. And yeah, from a young age, when I watched movies or dramas or read books, I just always felt more drawn towards men and masculinity. I watched how men dressed, walked, talked, how they gestured, how they sat, how they carried themselves, and I felt more drawn to do that. And also, boys have to learn how to do that too. And sometimes when you watch little boys, you will actually see them doing that. They'll be watching their fathers or uncles or other men in their life, and they'll be doing things the way they do it. So I've seen little boys get sticks and pretend to walk like their granddad or whatever. It's all a process, and we're drawn to one or we're drawn to the other. Usually people are drawn to the one they're supposed to be, but not always. So, I found a lot of the presentations and representations of masculinity were just what I felt more aligned with. And I think that's the same for, for boys and men. And then within that, I guess knowing that I was never meant to do it, or that this was something I was never meant to have, gave me a level of reflexivity about it. And also enabled me to see it, I guess, as a process, as something that isn't born, that doesn't come naturally, that is a process. And I've had to question a lot of it. I've had to question a lot of it myself.
I guess you've kind of highlighted it already, Finn, but I guess it's impossible to ignore the fact that at the moment in the UK, back in April, the Supreme Court made this ruling that the terms woman and sex, as they're defined in the Equality Act 2010, which is a really significant piece of legislation, that refers only to biological woman and to biological sex. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think the kind of ramifications of this decision might be on society for trans people.
Yes, I mean, we're going to have to wait and see. So the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Council, has sort of rushed out some guidance as to what they think the ruling means and what organisations and institutions, workplaces, service providers are going to have to do. All the government has said at the moment is that they think it's plain as day. They think it clarifies everything. They agree with what the Supreme Court said, but that is clearly not going to be enough. The ruling, there are already live cases going forward to challenge the ruling and take them to the European Court of Human Rights, because it is quite clearly an invasion of people's human rights to privacy and a family life, which is how the Gender Recognition Act 2004 came into the UK in the first place, because it was recognised that having to out yourself all the time as a trans person, when you may have been living in your trans identity as a trans man or a trans woman for a long time, having to out yourself because you, for example, didn't have paperwork that matched, was an invasion of your privacy. This is why the Gender Recognition Act was brought in the first place. And so what this new ruling is suggesting, by saying things like people should suddenly start using different toilets in a workplace, for example. What if you're a trans woman, you've been living as a trans woman for 20 years, 30 years, you're suddenly supposed to say to your colleagues, oh no, I'm going to go down the corridor and go to the men's toilets now. Well, that's bizarre. Why? So it is going to have a major effect, and it is going to be challenged. The rhetoric around it has just furthered and whipped up the gender wars. I've noticed this change happen overnight, that the media are now using terms a lot more like biological men, or they're using he, him pronouns to refer to trans women as a matter of course, and that this has shifted very quickly. We've already seen a massive increase of hate crimes being reported against the LGBT community as a whole, but in particular against trans people. And I can't help but feel that is only going to get worse. I think this type of rhetoric in the mainstream, it sanctions extreme behavior against people that are considered to be trans. And that should be enough. But it is not just trans people that will be affected. So the people that I, surveyed in my research, people like myself, I've gone through life, getting challenged in women's toilets. And I think this is only going to get worse. And I think it's going to make people feel that they have more sanction and free reign to be verbally or physically aggressive against people they think who look gender weird, who look a weirdo to them, that they don't think that they should be in a particular place. So yeah, unfortunately, I think that's going to increase.
Do you feel like it's? I mean, obviously, this is. You can certainly see in countries like the US how this is tied in with the kind of wider like right wing backlash. So notions about kind of a war against gender ideology, for example, and the scapegoating and demonizing of trans people is a key part of that. But do you think that also the demonization of trans people is a kind of, it's a more acceptable face of this kind of backlash against gender equality more broadly, where any challenging of gender norms is a kind of real pushback against that. How do you see it fitting in with this wider kind of right-wing backlash, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, conspiracies about gender ideology are as you've said, a key component of, unfortunately, this burgeoning right-wing movement and fascist movements that we're seeing. So conspiracies around that, they're a main part of that, which is not surprising because, of course, gender and sexuality is always something that states and that religion and particular political ideologies have always sought to control gender and sexuality, because at the root of that, they want to control women. So this is a fundamental issue of, feminism and women's rights in general. So we have all these conspiracy theories about gender ideology. And yes, attacking trans people is becoming, unfortunately, more and more acceptable. And the language from government and the language from the court, for example, only makes that more acceptable, unfortunately. And yes, we're seeing it. We're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen everywhere. And if you go back to the roots of where these terms originated, these conspiracies around gender ideology, you look to evangelical Christian right-wing movements in the US, for example, you can actually see it spelled out that those movements, and I'm thinking about things like Alliance Defending Freedom, the Family Policy Council, right-wing think tanks, so evangelical Christian right-wing think tanks and activists and lobby groups, they have long said that LGBTQ rights is some sort of poison that's taking hold in society, that it's gone too far, that it's been embedded into schools and colleges and workplaces, that it has to be ripped out, that it has to be attacked. You can look at influential literature produced by the Christian right wing as well, which defines the LGBT movement as the third wave of attack against the family. They mean the heterosexual nuclear family, but that's how it's constructed. Interestingly, they see women's rights and women's liberation as the first wave of attack on the family, as they call it, and gay rights being the second wave of attack on the family. And now they see trans rights, queer movement, LGBT rights as a whole as being this third strike against the nuclear family, heterosexual nuclear family. So from a long time ago, their mission has been to try and break up the LGBTQ rights movement by splitting off the T from the LGB. They're on record saying this. It's not a secret. They feel that there is less public support for trans rights, and that because we still live in quite a gender normative world and still live in quite a sex normative world, that actually they are betting on the fact that most people are a bit uncomfortable about gender strangeness or the idea of changing sex and living as a trans person, that they think most people will be bothered about that, and that this is how they will fracture the LGBTQ rights movement as a whole, by splitting off and alienating the trans movement. And sadly, they've been right. It's been a very effective campaign tactic, and I think our society still is very sex and gender normative.
And another dimension to this is the polarisation of positions on trans rights. It's caused massive rifts within the feminist and LGBTQ plus movements in the UK and beyond. And I wondered whether you thought there is hope of reconciling these positions and how that could be achieved, and how can we reach more sort of nuanced and empathetic stances?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's become a key feminist fracture. I mean, it's not as if feminists haven't in the past, disagreed about things and had fractures about things. They've been around all sorts of things. What the feminist movement is doing about racism within the movement, and then you had what got called the sex wars, wrongly kind of understood as the sex wars, and debates around where people stood on things like prostitution and pornography. So feminism, like any other social movement, has had its disagreements and fractures. But yes, unfortunately, this has become a very big one. And I think we're also seeing, as we did around some of those other fractures, friendships being broken, families being broken. It's having a real impact on individuals, and then also much more broadly as well, which is very unfortunate. But I think what we also need to do is, I think the genie's out of the bottle on this, but language like TERF being used to describe anti-trans inclusion activism. So people that are campaigning for trans people to be excluded from certain parts of life. So they're trans exclusionary campaigners. A lot of those people would say they are not anti-trans. They just want to exclude trans people from certain areas of life. So we have these trans exclusionary campaigners who may call themselves gender critical or GC. They may be feminists, they may not be feminists. They may not even be women. They may be men, but we see this language being used, TERF, standing for trans exclusionary radical feminist, being applied to these people. I've seen Trump being described by other people as a TERF. Now, I don't think Donald Trump is a feminist, let alone a radical feminist. And I've seen men like Andrew Neil, who used to present political shows like The Week, describing himself as a TERF. J.K. Rowling frequently gets described as a TERF. To my knowledge, she doesn't identify as a radical feminist. So again, you can see here what's happening is also that radical feminism is being further demonized and stigmatized, because you now have this understanding in the world that radical feminism is somehow synonymous with transphobia and trans exclusion, which is not the case. So in my book, what I also tried to do was to platform and showcase radical feminist theory from the late 1960s and 1970s, which is presciently queer, which is actually pro-trans and pro-trans inclusion in many ways. And I think that's important, and that's being lost. There were also trans women who played pivotal roles during the second wave. There were trans women living in lesbian feminist communes. There were trans women working for lesbian feminist and feminist businesses. All of this facts of history and of political theory is erased by these assumptions that we now have. And it's no coincidence that they end up further demonizing radical feminism, the feminism that is demonized anyway, that people are policed from identifying with and are therefore turned off from it, when I think it has such a lot of richness to offer and to help us figure our way through, maybe even through these gender debates. But sadly, I think what's happening with things like this Supreme Court ruling, it's not just about that. This is a step along the way. So when that ruling was announced, J.K. Rowling famously, shared on social media a photograph of herself on her super yacht, smoking a cigar and having a drink. And she said, "I love it when a plan comes together." She wasn't just talking about that, I don't feel, because a lot of these groups have said from the start that their aim is to repeal the Gender Recognition Act, to remove all kind of trans-related healthcare from the healthcare system, so that should only be available privately, if it's available at all, and only to people over 25. They've said they want the Equality Act rewritten to, adapt to that repealing of the GRA. Then you have more right-wing strands of that trans exclusionary movement that would also support things like Britain leaving the European Court of Human Rights and establishing a British Bill of Rights instead. So all of these things interlink, because some people will be all too happy to say, "Oh, you're right, the Equality Act is incompatible with this Supreme court ruling, and now Britain is going to be taken to the European Court by these gender weirdo loonies. Clearly, we need to escape this. We need to move away from that. We need to repeal the GRA. Their point has always been that being trans is a form of mental illness and that it shouldn't be legislated for, and that the Gender Recognition Act is a legal fiction, as some of these groups see it. So the plan that's coming together is not just that one thing about how it started, was whether trans women could be on women's shortlists to be on boards, the boards of businesses and public bodies in Scotland. That was how it all started. But it wasn't just about that. I think that was a convenient vehicle for a much longer strategy, which appears to be working, because our society is sex and gender normative. It is extremely heterosexist, much more so than people want to acknowledge. And also because, sadly, we're now in a period of burgeoning right-wing movements and burgeoning actual fascism, and the politics of the day from the government and governments around the world seem to be to actively go along with it or to actively appease it, which has the same outcome anyway, in that you just promote it.
I wanted to ask you a final question. I mean, your book, and you also mentioned earlier in the podcast, it contains some moving reflections about your own life and how you personally relate to these issues. And I wondered if you'd be willing to say anything a bit more about your own journey and the impact that feminism has, and radical feminism in particular, has had on your life. I mean, you've written, for example, about when you were at Greenham Common and how you got into this area of work. Do you want to say a bit more about your own engagement?
Yeah, sure. So I actually lived at a women's peace camp called Menwith Hill in Yorkshire, which is outside an NSA, American military spy base. So the NSA is the National Security Agency of America. It's called Menwith Hill. It's a huge, great American base out on the Yorkshire Dales. If you've ever gone walking around there, or you've been around there, you'll see what are called locally as the golf balls. They're these huge, giant golf balls. Those are actually giant white radomes protecting satellite dishes underneath, which are monitoring all telecommunications, and they're protected by these great big domes. So I left my home in rural Scotland. I come from a place near Lockerbie. It's a tiny, tiny little place. And so, I mean, I grew up on this always sounds a bit like country boy song, but I grew up on a tiny little dirt track in the middle of nowhere, a little one-bedroom stone cottage. As I said, my dad worked as a joiner. My mum did various different jobs. It was very hard to find work around there. Both of them were unemployed lots of times for lots of periods. Went to a tiny little local primary, 12 pupils in total. Most of us just run riot most of the time, working on farms and being outside a lot of the time. It was very much followed the agricultural year. And then when I was 17, I left to live at a women's peace camp. But that was all pretty crazy because I'd sort of been inspired by hearing about Greenham Common on the news. My parents also knew two women who lived in another village who had gone to Greenham Common and used to go there. There were little pockets of sort of liberal hippiness around there from that period where middle-class people in cities decided to downshift and move out to rural areas. Where I come from is very near a massive Tibetan Buddhist center called Sami Ling. And I remember that when it was just a commune. Now it's a huge retreat center, education center, temple, accommodation, all sorts. But that being there brought people to move there as well. So that was all part of that. So there were people from different walks of life around. And two of them were these women who'd gone to Greenham Common. And I just thought the stories of that were amazing. I was really inspired by that. I was inspired by the idea of direct political action, not just writing to an MP about something, but doing it yourself. I just always found that idea very, very inspiring. And because I grew up in countryside, living outdoors was kind of seemed normal to me. I was like, oh, that's great. Yeah, you live outdoors. Yeah, great. So yeah, I went to, I'd never even been on the train by myself, and I had to wait till my parents were out and then kind of sneak and use the phone, ring the operator. And most of your listeners may not even know what that was, but before the internet, if you wanted a phone number for things, you had to ring the operator and say, I need the number for this, and they would look it up and give you the number. So I got the number for the CND office in London, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and I just rang the office and said, are there any women's peace camps left in the country? And they said, oh, we've just got this alert, actually, from one in Yorkshire, Menwith Hill. They gave me the contact number. I then rang this woman called Betty, who lived in Otley in Yorkshire, and she, told me where I needed to get to, and then I made the arrangements, and off I went from Lockerbie rail station to Harrogate. And then I was met by women like Helen John, who was one of the founders of Greenham Common. Absolutely amazing woman. There was lots of Greenham women living there, and I just was inspired by all of them, really. And then through the peace camp, I met people in Leeds. I met women like Al Garthwaite, for example, who was one of the Leeds revolutionary radical feminists who started the first ever Reclaim the Night marches ever. In Leeds, and I just found all of that incredibly inspiring. I just felt like there were these legends kind of walking amongst us who'd done all of these things, and I wanted to do half of what they'd done. It was very inspiring. And the more I read and heard about radical feminism, and when I lived at the Women's Peace Camp, the women there, like Helen John, always saw their campaigns for peace as part of a feminist action. They saw themselves as resisting a patriarchal military-industrial complex. And all of that becomes very stark as well when you're living outside a military base. It's mainly male soldiers, male MOD police. And when you're arrested for things, or you're on an action and it's, say, 8 women singing peace songs in a road, and you have men in riot gear with dogs like physically picking you up and putting you in tiny little caged vans, it becomes very stark. It's right there in your face, gender politics and how the world is organized and who's protected and who isn't. So it was a feminist action. And then the more I heard about radical feminism, I just thought, well, that's actually how I thought the world was. So reading Radical Feminism, it gave a name to the way I'd thought anyway. And I thought, oh, great, this is an actual thing. Other people think this as well. And I still feel like that. I still feel like that when I read Radical Feminism. I think it's inspiring. It has answers for the challenges that we face today. And this is not ancient history. Many of these women are still amongst us, and we still have a lot to learn from that movement.
Oh, thanks so much for talking about that history, and your own history is also inspiring. And thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, I definitely think you can and should count yourself as one of those legends, Finn. So thank you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, Sandy, that was just an amazing experience, really. I was just kind of sitting in awe, just listening to Finn, learning so much. Such an incredibly powerful, impactful conversation, really. I love how they talk about radical feminism and make that accessible. And yeah, I think that there are so many myths and stereotypes which need to be challenged and broken down there. And I think we could all learn a great deal from radical feminism. So I'm grateful to Finn for that. But also, I was really impacted by the conversation about kind of trans rights and where things are at with that at the moment. I think it is quite a difficult issue, isn't it, in terms of, where there are these really significant debates and rifts within feminism and LGBTQ movements. I guess it, for us as men, right, it asks the question of what should we do about that? Where should we put ourselves? Should we be speaking out as well? Or is it our role to take a step back and remain silent? And I think, that's something we have to grapple with, because I have seen men on both sides of this kind of polarization making things worse, I think, in some cases, like targeting feminists because they disagree with them, in ways which I think actually potentially are quite misogynistic. And I think that's actually on both sides. So, and I think fundamentally, making this divide worse is just in the interests of patriarchy, really, isn't it? So I definitely don't think that's something we should be doing as men. So if we are going to make comments and take a stand, I think we need to do that in a careful, sensitive, nuanced, empathetic way, which Finn, I think, really demonstrates how you can do that. But at the same time, I guess that also can't be an excuse for inaction, can't it? And just not saying anything, not taking a stand at all, because the level of kind of demonization and stigmatization and hatred which trans people are experiencing in the UK, in countries across the world, I think we can't stay silent about that, really, can we? Because this is not a group with much power at all in society. And so I think we have a responsibility to speak out in support of them, really. Because ultimately, right, these issues are very much interconnected. I mean, what trans people, are dealing with more than anything is the same things that cisgender women are dealing with more than anything, right? Like men's violence. And I think Finn really demonstrates that. And patriarchy, right? These are the things which all of us ultimately, need to address. And so I think trying to focus on those commonalities that we all share, that it's in all of our interest to address these things.
Finn says that in their book, that the real barrier to trans inclusion and to further progress of trans rights is sexualized male violence. And that this is something that feminism has always fought against, So yes, I think that they make precisely that point. I was going to focus on a couple of other things. I mean, one was this notion of crisis, which is talked about a lot, a crisis of masculinity. I mean, Finn's approach is that masculinity is a crisis in itself. I was sort of reflecting at the same time that if there is a crisis of masculinity, then really it's a crisis for those who are at the sharp end of social, economic, and political change. And for women as well, and that those people at the higher echelons, if you want to use that term, of society, those who are in politics, law, media, and so on, those men who have power, they've always had power, and they still have power, and so for them, there isn't really a crisis in the same way at all, actually, So in a way, what we have is a mixture of continuity and crisis. The other thing that struck me was just Finn's final answer about Greenham Common, and obviously that was an issue of women's leadership and women camping at the base and so on. Men were involved in a supporting role as well. I mean, I remember participating in a symbolic act, if you like, a demonstration where we, men and women, joined hands between three sites, so Greenham Common and then Aldermaston and Burfield. These are all sites involved with, atomic weapons, basically, and weapons research. And, that got a lot of publicity at the time.
I did think it was interesting how the interview went full circle, right? That we started off talking about essentialism and kind of making these gender stereotypes seem natural. And that was kind of how the conversation ended as well, isn't it? And we are seeing this increased emphasis on, this idea of biological women, right, or biological men, and what does that actually mean? I think there's such a risk, isn't it, if we go down that route, if we're re-emphasizing biology as somehow naturally dividing us up. I think that's very dangerous territory, and we need to be challenging that, really. But I think that's probably enough from us, isn't it?
I think so, Stephen.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, as always, for listening. Contact us at nowamen@gmail.com if you have questions. Do subscribe to the podcast and share it among your peers. And we'll be back with another episode soon.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.